She was the last bride left at the border town auction. Then a broken cowboy raised his hand. The desert wind blew dust across the wooden planks of the border town's auction block, a wind that carried with it the smell of gunpowder and smoke from the burned-out farms beyond the ridge. She stood alone, the last bride left at the auction, her pale dress stained with the travel of days and her eyes hollow with the weight of what had been forced upon her. Men shouted prices, voices cutting through the heat, each one not bidding for love but for possession. The sound of boots against dirt echoed, a sharp crack of spurs slicing the air. And then, when no one else dared raise a hand, when the laughter of the saloon doors mocked her trembling frame, a broken cowboy, scarred by battles no one dared speak of, lifted his hand. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. The auctioneer's hammer struck, and the fate of two souls was bound together in silence. He led her from the block without a word, his stride strong though his back bore the heaviness of a past he tried to bury. She followed, clutching what little dignity remained, her eyes fixed on the hollow horizon where the sun dipped red against the earth. His cabin stood at the edge of town, weathered wood against the endless plains, a place of solitude more than home. She stepped inside, and silence greeted her, broken only by the crack of firewood. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw the scars burned into the walls, the fragments of letters, and the boxes of memories he had tried to cast away. He reached for one, a folded page trembling between calloused fingers, then tossed it into the fire. Flames leapt, devouring words that once carried promises now turned to ashes. She stood still, her breath caught as one letter refused to burn, rising with the flames, carried by the heat past the open door where the desert met the endless sky. He turned his gaze toward her, and in that moment she saw not just a cowboy, but a man torn between ruin and redemption. Nights grew heavy with silence, yet slowly, the weight of his brokenness met the fragile strength in her heart. They sat together on the porch, the cool wind wrapping around them as the flames from smoldering wreckage nearby painted the night with shadows. He rolled his sleeves, revealing scars etched into flesh, battles fought in saloons, in deserts, and in the torment of his own soul. She reached for his arm, her delicate hand wrapping over his rough skin. His body stiffened, unaccustomed to touch that did not carry demand or violence, but her presence softened him. For the first time in years, he allowed another to bind his wounds, not just the ones etched into his flesh but the deeper ones carved into his spirit. And though no words were spoken, the fire in the distance mirrored the one beginning to flicker inside them both. But the border town was no place for quiet hearts. Shadows of violence lingered beyond the ridge, and men with guns and grudges found their way to the ranch. One night, the flames of destruction returned, not from the hearth, but from the barn set alight under the moon's pale eye. Horses cried out, and the crack of revolvers shattered the stillness. He stood tall in the yard, the weight of his pistol heavy at his side. Smoke curled into the night sky as three riders emerged from the firelight, guns drawn, vengeance burning in their eyes. She rushed to his side, her dress catching sparks as the fire crept closer, her voice trembling not with fear but with a plea for him to stand. He raised his weapon, but not with rage, with resolve, a man no longer broken but anchored by the woman who had once been nothing more than the last bride left at an auction. Now, she was his. Reason to fight. Steel clashed with fire as bullets tore through the night. He faced them with unshaken stance, the woman at his side refusing to retreat. The barn burned brighter, illuminating every shadow of violence, every ghost of his past. One outlaw lunged, another raised his revolver, but the cowboy's hand was quicker, his aim steadier. Smoke filled their lungs, ash clung to her gown, yet she held on to him, her grip pulling him from despair each time his knees threatened to buckle. When the last gun fell silent, when the barn's flames became nothing more than embers, he dropped his weapon to the dirt. His chest rose heavy, his breath torn between exhaustion and release. She touched his face, streaked with soot, and though the town had tried to strip her of freedom, and life had tried to strip him of hope, together they had forged something unbreakable. The desert would always burn, the town would always hunger for blood, but inside the broken cowboy's arms, she was no longer the bride sold at an auction. She was the woman who chose to stay, who rebuilt his ruins with her quiet strength. And in her presence, he was no longer the man defeated by his past, but the one who found redemption in the fire. The desert had its own silence, one that wrapped itself around the soul like a shroud. Days after the flames swallowed his barn and the gun smoke cleared from the night air, that silence sat heavy over them both. The broken cowboy, though he had stood tall against the men who came to destroy what little he had left, carried the weight of their blood and the cost of survival. He did not boast about the fight, nor speak of victory. His voice was quiet, his hands busy with what remained, stacking charred beams, pulling blackened iron from the earth, repairing what fire and fury had consumed. She walked beside him, her dress catching soot as her hands carried buckets of water to douse the last embers, her heart caught between fear and resolve. She had not chosen this life. It had been forced on her by fate and auctioneer, yet in the ashes of his ruin, she felt the strange seed of belonging begin to take root. At night, when the fire crackled low inside the cabin and shadows danced along the wood-paneled walls, she watched him with eyes that searched for more than the hard shell he wore. He sat by the window, staring into the endless horizon, a bottle untouched at his side. Once, perhaps, he had drowned himself in whiskey to quiet the ghosts, but now he resisted, gripping the chair as though the world itself might slip from under him if he let go. She wanted to ask about the past, about the scars that marred his flesh and the battles that still haunted his eyes, but each time her lips parted, the weight of his silence stilled her voice. He was a man torn between wanting her near and fearing what her presence might awaken inside him. Yet even in that quiet distance, there was a tether between them, invisible and undeniable. The town whispered. News of the auction bride and the cowboy who claimed her traveled faster than the wind. Saloon doors swung open with gossip. Rough voices spoke of his madness, of the fire at his barn, of the woman who now lived in his house. Men sneered, women scoffed, but beneath the words was an undercurrent of fear, for they knew he was not a man to cross lightly. He had fought in border wars, killed more than any would dare count, and lived through the kind of hell that left others buried in shallow graves. Still, she felt the sting of their whispers when she walked through town, fetching supplies with her head high and her heart pounding. To them, she was just the bride no one wanted, the last woman left on the block, a reminder of desperation. But when she returned to the cabin and saw him waiting by the porch, his hand resting on the railing, his gaze steady and unyielding, she felt the rumors burn to ash inside her chest. Whatever they thought, she belonged nowhere else but here. Days bled into weeks, and the rhythm of survival shaped their bond. He worked the land, repairing fences and tending to the few animals that remained, while she mended clothes, cooked meals, and brought order to the cabin that had once been only a shelter for a solitary man. Slowly, her touch transformed it. Curtains softened the harsh lines of the windows, fresh linens covered the rough bed, and flowers gathered from the fields breathed life into the wooden space. He noticed, though he said little, his eyes lingering on the changes, the faintest curve of gratitude tracing his lips before he returned to his labor. One evening, when the sun sank low and painted the horizon with blood-red fire, she brought him water as he hammered nails into a broken fence post. His hands were blistered, his shirt clung to his back with sweat, but when she reached for the hammer, offering to take his place, he paused. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, neither moved. Then, without words, he handed her the tool. The weight of iron passed from his hands into hers, and in that exchange, something deeper was forged. Yet shadows never linger far from light. The men who had come to burn his barn were not lone wolves. They were tied to something larger, a gang that ruled the ridges with blood and iron. Their leader, a man known only as Cutter, heard of the failed raid and the deaths of his men. Vengeance festered like an open wound. Cutter was no stranger to the cowboy. Once, years ago, they had stood side by side in a war that blurred the line between justice and cruelty. But where the cowboy had turned his back on slaughter, Cutter had embraced it, building a kingdom of outlaws. Now, hearing of the bride, of the fight, and of the ranch still standing, Cutter's wrath boiled. He swore the cowboy would pay, not just with his life, but with hers. The night Cutter's riders came again, the moon was a thin silver blade across the sky. She woke first, her instincts sharp, her breath caught by the sound of hooves drumming against the earth. She touched his shoulder, and his eyes opened instantly, the reflex of a man who had learned long ago never to sleep deeply. He rose, pulled on his boots, and buckled his gun belt with steady hands. Through the cracks of the cabin walls, the glow of torches flickered. She clutched his arm, whispering his name, but he only turned and pressed a hand to her face. It was the first time he had touched her with tenderness, his rough palm cupping her cheek as if to anchor them both. "Stay inside," he said, his voice gravel and fire. But she shook her head. Fear trembled in her chest, yet resolve shone in her eyes. "Not without you." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded once, as though conceding to a truth he could not deny. Outside, fire lit the horizon, and Cutter's men rode in like demons from the night. They surrounded the ranch, torches raised, guns gleaming under moonlight. Cutter himself dismounted, his broad frame casting a shadow across the dirt. "Come out, old friend," he called, his voice carrying across the silence. "Or I'll burn what's left and take the woman you think you've saved." The cowboy stepped forward, pistol in hand, his figure outlined against the flames that licked at the barn. She followed, her dress glowing in the firelight, her presence a defiance Cutter did not expect. The standoff was tense, every breath heavy, every eye watching for the twitch of a trigger finger. The cowboy raised his gun, Cutter drew his blade, and the world seemed to still in the heartbeat before violence erupted. Gunfire cracked, shattering the night. Horses reared, men shouted, bullets tore through wood and air alike. The cowboy moved with deadly precision, every shot deliberate, every motion honed by years of survival. She stood behind him, her hands clutching the folds of her dress, her heart pounding with each flash of the revolver. Smoke burned her lungs, yet she did not falter. At one point, a rider broke through the chaos, charging toward her with a pistol raised. Her scream caught in her throat, but before the shot rang, the cowboy spun, firing with unerring accuracy. The rider fell, his body tumbling into the dirt at her feet. Her breath came ragged, her hands trembling, but when she looked at him, she saw not just the man who saved her, but the man who trusted her strength enough to fight with her at his side. The battle stretched into the dark hours, the fire from the barns lighting the sky like dawn. Cutter, relentless, pressed forward, his blade gleaming as he clashed with the cowboy in the heart of the flames. Steel met steel, fists struck flesh, and the earth itself seemed to shake beneath their struggle. She watched, unable to move, torn between rushing forward and holding back. Blood stained the dirt, and the cowboy staggered under the force of Cutter's blows, his strength waning. But then his eyes found hers, her face lit by fire, her fear laced with unyielding belief, and something ignited within him. With a final surge, he drove Cutter back, disarming him and pressing him to the earth. Cutter's breath came ragged, his eyes wide with rage, but the cowboy did not deliver the killing blow. Instead, he stepped back, chest heaving, and spat into the dirt. "This ends here." Cutter fled into the shadows, broken but alive, his men scattering like leaves in the wind. When silence finally fell, the fire reduced to embers, she ran to him. His body was bruised, blood trickled from his lip, but his arms were strong as they wrapped around her. For the first time since the auction block, she wept, not from fear, but from the release of survival, from the certainty that she was no longer alone. He held her, his chin pressed against her hair, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of life reclaimed. The desert had tried to break them, the town had tried to brand them, but together, they stood unshaken. And though the horizon still held threats, and the wind still carried whispers of vengeance, they had forged something no fire could consume. The morning after the battle smelled of ash and blood. Smoke still curled from the blackened beams of the barn, and the ground outside the cabin bore the scars of boots and bodies. He rose before the sun, as he always did, but his steps were slower now, his strength drained by the violence of the night. She woke to find him already outside, sitting on the edge of the porch with his revolver resting across his knees. His hat shaded his eyes, but she could see the hollow weariness in the slope of his shoulders. Quietly, she stepped out to him, her bare feet brushing the cool planks. She said nothing at first, only placed a tin cup of water beside him and rested her hand against his arm. He did not look at her, but he did not pull away. That small acceptance, in a man so guarded, was more than any words could give. When the sun crept higher, painting the plains in gold, they worked side by side. He repaired the fences Cutter's men had broken, driving posts into the earth with steady determination. She gathered what remained of the livestock, coaxing frightened animals back into the pen, whispering to them as if her voice could erase the memory of fire. Their tasks were simple, but their silence was not empty. It was full, thick with the weight of everything they had endured and everything they could not yet speak. At midday, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at her. The faintest curve touched his lips, a fleeting smile, fragile as glass. She caught it and held it in her heart, knowing it was the beginning of something he did not yet dare to name. But Cutter's shadow lingered. Word came from town. Men who had once ridden with him were gathering again. Some spoke of revenge, others of justice, but all eyes turned toward the cowboy. He was no longer just a broken man living at the edge of the desert. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. In the saloons, his name carried weight. Whispers said he had turned down death itself, that he had stood against Cutter and lived. The town folk watched her too, their gazes sharp with curiosity and suspicion. When she walked through the dusty streets to fetch flour and lamp oil, she heard their murmurs, the bride who had stood beside a man when fire and bullets rained. She did not answer them, but each step she took was steady, and each glance she gave was firm. If they saw weakness in her, they would be mistaken. Nights grew long in that uneasy peace. On the porch, beneath the sweep of stars, she and the cowboy spoke in fragments, pieces of themselves offered slowly, as if testing the air between them. He told her once, in a voice so low she almost missed it, about a brother who had died in a border skirmish, about the guilt that had carved itself into his chest. She listened, her hand resting lightly on his, not pressing for more, only anchoring him in the present. In return, she shared the story of her father, a farmer who had lost his land to debt and sickness, leaving her with nothing but desperation. That desperation had led her to the auction block. When she finished, he turned his head toward her, his eyes catching the starlight. "They took you because you were the last left," he said. "But I raised my hand because I saw more than they did." Her breath caught, and she looked away, not because she doubted him, but because the weight of his words was almost too much to bear. The desert tested them again. Weeks later, a storm rolled across the plains, fierce and unrelenting. Rain lashed against the cabin walls, lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the earth. The creek that had once trickled near the ranch swelled into a raging torrent, threatening to wash away the land they had fought so hard to hold. He tied ropes to the posts, wading waist deep into the rushing water to save what he could, while she held the lines from the bank, her body straining against the pull. For hours, they battled the storm together, until their hands bled and their muscles screamed. When at last the water receded, leaving behind wreckage and mud, they collapsed side by side on the soaked earth. The rain still fell, cold and relentless, but they laughed, laughter born not of joy, but of survival. In that storm, they had learned something the flames and bullets had not yet shown them. Together, they were unbreakable. But Cutter had not forgotten. In the darkness of the ridges, he gathered new men, outlaws hardened by greed and cruelty. They rode under a banner of vengeance, their numbers swelling with each passing week. The town began to fear again, and the whispers returned. This time, it was not just about the cowboy, it was about the war that might come because of him. Some said he should leave, that he should take his bride and disappear into the desert to spare them. Others said he should stand and fight, leave the town against Cutter's gang. The weight of expectation pressed against him like chains. He wanted nothing more than peace, a life quiet enough to forget the ghosts of his past. But peace had no place in a land where law was written in blood. One evening, when the sky burned orange and the shadows stretched long across the fields, he stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the horizon. She joined him, her hand slipping into his without hesitation. "You're thinking of leaving," she said softly. He turned to her, his jaw tight. "If I stay, more blood will come. If I go, maybe it ends here." Her fingers tightened around his. "And what becomes of me, if you go?" He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the frightened bride who had stood trembling at the auction block, but the woman who had fought beside him through fire, storm, and blood. "You deserve more than this life," he whispered. She shook her head, her eyes fierce. "I deserve truth. And the truth is, I belong here, with you." Her words anchored him, cutting through the storm of doubt that raged inside. He realized then that leaving would not end the bloodshed. Cutter would not stop until he was dead or broken again. The only choice left was to stand. That night, he cleaned his guns with meticulous care, every motion deliberate. She watched him from across the table, her hands folded in her lap, her face lit by the flicker of lamplight. When he finished, he looked at her, his eyes steady. "If I fall, you run." She rose, walked to him, and placed her hand over his. "If you fall, I fall beside you." The days that followed were heavy with preparation. He trained her to shoot, her small hands trembling at first, then steadying with each pull of the trigger. The crack of gunfire echoed across the plains as she learned to hold her ground. He taught her to ride hard, to tie knots, to move silently through the brush. She absorbed every lesson with a quiet determination that surprised even him. When he looked at her now, he no longer saw a woman carried by fate. He saw a partner, forged in fire and storm, unyielding as the desert itself. The final clash came under a moon swollen and bright. Cutter rode with a dozen men, their torches turning night into day, their laughter carrying across the fields like the sound of wolves. The cowboy and the woman stood together at the edge of the ranch, side by side, weapons ready. The ground trembled with the approach of horses, the air thick with the promise of violence. And though fear coiled in their bellies, they did not falter. For they had already faced fire and storm, already lost and rebuilt. Whatever came now, they would face it together. The first shot rang out, and the night erupted. Bullets split the air, fire spread through the dry grass, and men shouted as chaos consumed the land. She moved as he had taught her, her aim steady, her breath controlled. He fought with the precision of a man who had lived too long with death at his side. Together, they cut through the wave of violence, their bond unshaken. But Cutter himself was relentless, cutting through his men with fury, his eyes locked on the cowboy. Their duel was inevitable, a reckoning years in the making. They met in the heart of the blaze, steel and fire colliding. Cutter's rage was a storm, his strikes wild and merciless. The cowboy met him with calm precision, each motion honed by discipline and need. She watched, her heart pounding, ready to fire if he fell, but knowing this was his fight. Blood stained the ground, the roar of fire filled their ears, and at last, the cowboy drove Cutter back, his gun pressed to the outlaw's chest. Silence fell for a breath, broken only by the crackle of flames. Cutter sneered, his voice a hiss. "Do it, you'll never escape what you are." But the cowboy did not pull the trigger. Instead, he lowered his gun, his voice steady. "I'm not the man you think I am anymore." Cutter's eyes widened, fury twisting into confusion. In that moment of hesitation, the woman raised her pistol and fired. The shot rang true, striking Cutter down. The outlaw fell, his body crumpling into the dirt, his reign of terror ending not by the man he despised, but by the woman he had underestimated. The field went quiet. The gang scattered, broken without their leader. The fire dimmed, leaving smoke and embers in its wake. She dropped the gun, her hands trembling, and he caught her before she fell. His arms wrapped around her, holding her against his chest as the night swallowed the last echoes of violence. For the first time in years, his eyes softened, the weight of his past lifting, if only slightly. She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears, and whispered, "We're free." He pressed his forehead to hers, the silence between them full of everything they could not say. Around them, the desert stretched wide and endless, scarred but alive. They had faced fire, storm, and blood, and yet they stood. Together, they would build again, not because the world had given them peace, but because they had taken it with their own hands. And in that moment, under the watch of the endless stars, they knew the truth. Neither broken cowboy nor auction bride defined them anymore. They were something stronger, something forged in the crucible of survival, unbreakable, unyielding, and forever bound. The morning sun rose with a gentle glow, painting the horizon in shades of gold and soft pink, as if the heavens themselves wanted to bless the fragile peace that had taken root inside the ranch. The little girl woke first, her tiny hands reaching instinctively for the woman who had become her safe place. She whispered softly, "Mama," with a sweetness that carried no hesitation, no doubt, only the pure innocence of a child's certainty. The woman opened her eyes slowly, the word echoing in her heart with such force that tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She had been called many things in her life, maid, orphan, burden, but never, Mama. That single word shook her to the core, piercing through years of loneliness like a ray of sunlight cutting through storm clouds. The rancher's daughter, with her messy curls and sleepy smile, had given her more than a name. She had given her identity, something she didn't even know she had been craving so deeply. She hugged the child tightly, inhaling the sweet scent of innocence, whispering, "I'm here, Amor, I'll always be here." The girl nestled closer, and for a moment the woman felt as though she had been entrusted with the greatest treasure in existence. But as warmth filled her heart, fear tried to creep in. She wondered how long this fragile happiness could last. What if the rancher changed his mind? What if life, with its cruel habit of tearing away every good thing she ever touched, decided to strike again? She shook the thoughts away, refusing to let shadows spoil what the dawn had gifted her. Instead, she focused on the sound of the girl's steady breathing, promising herself that she would protect this bond no matter the cost. When the rancher entered the room, his steps soft yet steady, he paused at the sight before him. His daughter clung to the woman as though she were her entire world, and the woman, with tears on her face, looked like someone who had just discovered life for the first time. Something stirred inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He knew his daughter needed a mother's love, but seeing this, seeing how naturally the bond had formed, was something he hadn't expected. It wasn't forced, it wasn't convenient, it was real. He cleared his throat gently, and both the woman and the child looked up. The girl ran to her father, throwing her arms around his legs, but quickly turned back to the woman, tugging her hand so that she too would stand beside them. The rancher's chest tightened as he realized the truth. His daughter didn't see separation anymore. She had already woven the woman into their lives, stitching her presence into every corner of her heart. The day began with quiet chores, but beneath the routine, emotions ran deep. The woman found herself watching the rancher more closely, studying how he moved through the land, how his hands bore the marks of hard work, how his silence wasn't cold but rather careful. She wondered what kind of wounds he carried, what storms had hardened his gaze yet left him tender enough to let her stay. For his part, the rancher noticed how she carried herself, grace hidden beneath humility, strength wrapped in gentleness. She didn't just work, she cared. Every corner she cleaned, every meal she prepared, she infused with a love that had been denied her in her own life, but which flowed freely now as if it had been waiting for this very chance. The girl followed them both everywhere, her laughter echoing across the fields like music that healed old scars. When she held the woman's hand in one of her tiny fists and the rancher's hand in the other, she seemed to bridge the gap between two souls who had lived too long in silence. The rancher began to wonder if perhaps this was no accident, if perhaps destiny had written a story none of them had expected but all of them needed. Yet with every step toward closeness, the woman's fears whispered louder. She couldn't silence the voice inside that reminded her she was nothing but a maid. She feared the whispers of others if they saw her holding this place in the rancher's home and heart. She feared the day the rancher would wake up and realize she wasn't worthy of what was unfolding. Still, each time the little girl's voice rang out, calling her, "Mama," those fears crumbled, replaced by a courage she never thought she had. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in fire, the rancher stood on the porch, his daughter playing nearby with her dolls while the woman watched her with quiet devotion. The rancher turned toward her, his voice low but steady. "You've given my daughter something I couldn't. She laughs more now, she sleeps without fear, she calls you something she's never called anyone else." He paused, searching her eyes. "Do you know what that means to me?" Her heart raced. She wanted to answer, but her voice trembled. "I didn't plan it," she whispered. She chose me. And I couldn't push her away. I couldn't push love away." The rancher studied her face, and for the first time, his guarded expression softened completely. "Maybe that's the point. Love isn't planned. It just happens, when you least expect it." The silence between them carried more than words ever could. The woman looked away, tears burning her eyes, not because of pain but because of the weight of something new, something she barely dared to name. Could it be love? Could it be that the rancher, behind his steady gaze, was beginning to feel something for her too? That night, when the girl insisted both of them sit by her bed until she fell asleep, the woman and the rancher found themselves side by side in the quiet glow of the lamp. The girl's small hand rested on both of theirs, as if binding them together in a silent promise. Neither of them spoke, but in the hush of that moment, both felt it, the pull of destiny, the weaving of three lives into one story. The days that followed only deepened the bond. The woman taught the girl songs her mother had once sung to her before fate had stolen her family away. The girl clung to every word, every note, as though she were gathering treasures. The rancher, listening from the doorway, felt a stirring in his heart, a reminder that life could still hold beauty after so much loss. But storms do not stay away forever. The more the woman and child grew close, the more the rancher began to fear losing them. His heart, hardened by years of solitude, whispered warnings. He had already buried too much, lost too much. What if letting this woman into their lives meant opening the door to pain again? What if fate took her away, too? His fear made him distant at times, retreating into silence that confused the woman. She wondered if she had overstepped, if her presence had become too much. One night, unable to hold it in, she confronted him. Her voice trembled, but her spirit stood strong. If you don't want me here, tell me. I'll go. But don't punish me with silence. Don't make me feel like I've stolen something I never meant to take. The rancher's eyes burned with emotions he had buried for years. You don't understand, he said, his voice rough. Every time I look at you, I see what I could lose. I've already lost more than most men can bear. I don't know if I can survive losing again. Her tears fell freely, but she stepped closer. And what if you never lose me? What if, for once, life gave you something meant to stay? The weight of her words pierced through his fear, and for the first time, he allowed himself to hope. He reached out, his rough hand trembling as it touched hers, and in that fragile touch lay a promise unspoken, that maybe, just maybe, they were no longer two broken souls, but one family being pieced together by love, fate, and the innocence of a child who had already chosen for them both. The girl stirred in her sleep and called out softly, "Mama, Papa." The sound froze them both, stealing their breath. The woman's eyes widened, the rancher's chest tightened, and in that single word, spoken with such innocent certainty, the future stretched before them like a path lit by stars. And in the silence that followed, they both knew, this was no accident. This was destiny. The next morning carried with it a stillness that seemed almost sacred. The woman rose before dawn, as she often did, and walked out to the fields where the dew clung to the tall grass like tiny diamonds. She needed the silence, the wide open sky, the breath of air that carried freedom and fear in equal measure. She placed her hand over her chest, where her heart beat fast, almost painfully, as though it were demanding something she still struggled to accept. She had been given more than she ever dreamed of. A child who called her Mama, a man whose guarded eyes had begun to soften, and a home that felt less like work and more like belonging. But could she trust it? Could she trust herself to believe that God, or destiny, or fate, had truly chosen her for this family? Behind her, the crunch of boots on soil broke her thoughts. She turned and saw the rancher standing a few feet away, his tall frame outlined against the rising sun. For a moment neither spoke, but the silence was heavy, charged with everything they had not said the night before. Finally, he stepped closer. "You were right," he said, his voice low and rough, like a confession pulled from the deepest part of him. "I've been running from hope. I've been hiding behind fear. But last night, when she called us Mama and Papa, something inside me broke, or maybe it healed. I don't know which. All I know is, I can't keep pretending I don't need you. I can't keep pretending she doesn't need you. We both do." Her breath caught, tears rushing to her eyes before she could stop them. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear of being unwanted, unloved, unworthy, seemed to melt beneath his words. But still, doubt whispered, fragile and insistent. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. "What if I'm not enough? What if?" He cut her off gently but firmly, stepping close enough that his shadow fell across hers. "You are enough. You've been enough since the moment she called you Mama. And he hesitated, his jaw tightening as though the words were hard for him, not because they weren't true, but because they carried the weight of years of silence. "I feel something I thought I buried forever. I feel it when I see you laugh with her, when I see you work beside me, when I see the strength you don't even know you have. I don't want to lose you. Not now, not ever." The words wrapped around her like a cloak of warmth. Her tears spilled freely, but this time they weren't from sorrow. They were the tears of someone who had been thirsty for love and had finally found water in the desert. She whispered, her voice trembling but fierce, "Then don't let me go." In that moment, something shifted between them, as though the earth itself recognized the union forming. The rancher reached out, his rough hand cradling her face, and for the first time, his lips met hers in a kiss that carried all the pain, all the healing, all the hope of two broken souls daring to love again. It was not just passion. It was a sealing, a covenant unspoken, witnessed only by the rising sun and the fields that stretched out like eternity before them. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, but the air between them was alive with promise. The rancher's eyes, once so guarded, now burned with something clear and unshakable. From this day, he said firmly, we build this life together. Not as a master and a maid, but as a man and a woman, as a father and a mother, as a family. The word, family, lingered in the air like a song, and the woman closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider pressing her nose against the glass of other people's joy. She was inside, part of something whole, chosen not by chance but by destiny. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives began to settle into something beautiful. The girl thrived, her laughter filling every corner of the ranch, her confidence blooming under the certainty that she had both a father and a mother who adored her. The woman worked, not as a servant but as a partner, her hands and heart shaping the ranch into a place where love grew alongside the crops and livestock. The rancher, once silent and guarded, began to speak more freely, his voice carrying stories of his past, his dreams, his fears. Together, they built not just a household, but a sanctuary. But as every story demands, the test came. One evening, word spread through the nearby town that a distant relative of the rancher, his late wife's brother, had heard rumors about the woman's new place in the household. The man came, filled with bitterness, claiming the rancher was dishonoring his sister's memory by allowing a maid to take her place. His words were sharp, cruel, designed to wound. He stood on the porch, pointing at the woman with disdain. She doesn't belong here. She's nothing. She's a servant, and you're making a mockery of everything my sister stood for. The woman stood frozen, her old fears crashing back like a wave determined to drown her. She wanted to run, to flee before she was cast out. But before she could move, the rancher stepped forward, his body shielding hers, his voice ringing with a strength that silenced the night. You're wrong, he said firmly. You think I'm dishonoring my wife's memory. No, what dishonors her memory is raising our daughter without the love she deserves. What dishonors her memory is closing my heart to the chance of life again. This woman has given my child a mother's love, a love that no one else could give. She belongs here because my daughter chose her, because my heart chose her, because God Himself placed her in our path. And if you can't see that, then you have no place here. The relative sputtered with anger, but the rancher's words carried the weight of truth, undeniable and immovable. The man left, his bitterness trailing behind him like dust, and the silence that followed was filled with the sound of the woman's quiet sobs. But they weren't sobs of fear. They were sobs of relief, of healing, of finally knowing she had been defended, not dismissed. The rancher turned to her, his eyes burning with the same fire that had silenced his accuser. No one will ever take you from us. No one. The little girl, who had watched the scene with wide eyes, ran forward and threw her arms around them both. Mama, Papa, she whispered, her voice trembling but full of certainty. We're together forever, right? The woman knelt, holding the girl close, her tears falling into the child's hair. Forever, Amor. Forever. The rancher placed his hand over both of them, his voice steady as stone. Forever. And so it was. From that day forward, no voice, no shadow, no storm could shake what had been built. The ranch became not just a place of work, but a place of love, laughter, and life. The woman who had once begged for scraps and a corner to sleep had found herself not only with food and shelter, but with a family, a name, a love that would carry her into eternity. Years later, when the girl grew and looked back, she would tell others of the woman who came into their lives as nothing and became everything. She would tell of how love can appear where you least expect it, how broken souls can heal each other, and how sometimes destiny whispers not with thunder but with the softest voice of a child saying, Mama. And in the end, that was the truth that outlived them all. Love is not measured by where you came from, but by the courage to stay when life offers you a place to belong. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.